Today I sat down with Adrian Johnston, one of the founders of Una Brands, one of the aggregators, or the first aggregator, I should say, out of the APAC region. So they're out of both Australia and Singapore, as I understand it. They've raised 40 million to date, and they are taking on the traditional or the now well-known aggregator model, but focused on the Southeast Asia market. So for anyone who's selling on Shopee or Lazada, these are your guys. Really interesting team and background. I was blown away how operationally savvy they are when I had the chance to sit down with them. But in this episode, we talk a lot about what they're looking for, how they differentiate themselves. And I think it's really interesting, again, to look at things that are outside of the norm, outside of just the standard FBA aggregator, which we are starting to see that it is definitely a proven opportunity, but let's see how far it goes. And again, these guys have a new and unique perspective, and I think it's a great one to listen into. Welcome to Successful Scales, the show where I talk to world-class professionals on what it takes to scale successful businesses. I dive deep asking questions to people who are running unicorn businesses, to raising funds, to buying businesses, mergers and acquisitions, IP and patent law, what is to manage performance management. I mean, the list goes on. The idea really is, how do I create knowledge and learning for you guys listening in? And of course, myself, getting the floor with people who I, in many cases, would never dream to share a room with. Before we jump into the episode, I've got to give a special thank you to our sponsors. Firstly, over at Global Wide Advisors, a leading digital consumer products investment bank focused on optimizing the sales process. An incredible team, always happy to pick up the phone and educate you or anyone about the sales process and what you should really consider, and can obviously help take you to market or even acquire businesses. I ring them for just about everything these days. Us over at Multiply Me, we are the end-to-end executive search and HR function into the Philippines, helping find better talent and onboarding them effectively. And last but not least, Escala, our management consultancy focused on process improvement, where we help build better systems for your business. That's all the ads you're going to get from me, ladies and gentlemen. The rest is all about learning. I hope you really enjoy and get as much out of these sessions as I do, sitting face-to-face with some of the world-renowned leaders in their respective fields, asking them the tough questions that they're not often asked. Adrian, welcome to an episode of Successful Scales, mate. How you doing?
I'm great. Yeah, great to be here.
I'm stoked to sit down. We've had some great conversations. I was fortunate enough to meet both of your co-founders and, have been nothing but impressed by everything I've heard coming out of each of you guys, stellar team. And before I ruin the punchlines and take too much of the limelight here, I'd love you to just walk me through a little bit about you for those listening at home, to get a bit of an insight of who you are. And then I'd love to then step into a little bit about what you guys at Una Brands are looking to achieve, because I'm super excited by everything you guys are doing. And, I think that there's a lot to learn. So let me hand it over to you, my friend.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I'm Adrian. I'm one of the co-founders of Una Brands. I'm the head of the Australia office and also the head of strategy. So Una Brands launched at the beginning of the year. We had a fundraise in May where we raised $40 million to kick things off, which was the largest seed funding round at the time. We've actually just gone through our Series A funding round as well. We've acquired a pretty large portfolio of brands already, and we're kind of on a very rapid growth trajectory. We're looking to acquire another kind of 10 or 15 brands before the end of the year. But in terms of my background, so I, prior to Una Brands, I've actually had a bit of a weird background. I've had 3 careers. I spent 3 years as a high school math teacher in London, which was interesting but random. Then I went into investment banking at Goldman Sachs for 3 years. And then most recently, I've actually been working at Boston Consulting Group for 5 years as a consultant specializing in e-commerce. And it was really kind of through my work at BCG that I became aware of the aggregator model, and I first kind of saw that taking off in the States, and then realized that there was a big opportunity, and therefore decided to launch something similar in Australia.
Yeah, very, very cool to hear 3 careers. I mean, from math teacher to investment banker, and now co-founding, the latest aggregator with a twist, I might add as well. I mean, before we hit record, and the last few conversations we've had, I've gotten to understand a little bit more of your model, which I'm sure we'll dive into in a little bit. But how did you go from being a math teacher to working with Goldman Sachs? How did that happen?
Yeah, that was a bit random. So one thing that's not on my LinkedIn is that I actually interned at Lehman Brothers in the summer of 2008, right before they went bankrupt. And so after the kind of financial crisis, all the rest of it, I went into teaching. I actually wanted to be a math teacher since I was like a wee nipper. And so I decided to go into teaching. In the UK, we have a thing called Teach First, which is where you work in, you straight out of university, you go and teach in what they call schools in challenging circumstances, which is basically inner city London kind of schools. So I did that for 3 years, and then through that program as well, I was able to intern at Goldman, and then went to join them full time after that. But it was a bit of a change from teaching to trading.
Yeah, I can only imagine inner city London. Would have definitely cut your teeth on some rough experiences. I can only imagine.
Yeah, for sure. The school was, had its. It was an interesting place to work, put it that way.
It wasn't the same as working at BCG.
Yeah, not quite.
Not quite, huh? Well. Yeah, no, I mean, I can only imagine it'd be chalk and cheese. For those Americans listening, is that a saying in the UK too? Chalk and cheese? It's definitely.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, good. What was it like at BCG? I mean, we were talking as well before we hit record. We're building a consulting practice more so on the EY model, but we're trying to move toward more of the Accenture model and how they actually structure their teams. It feels more scalable. But I'd be curious to hear, 5 years at BCG is not a small amount of time in one of, I'd argue one of the great companies or one of the great consulting practices on the planet, and working and getting, really deep insights into the e-commerce space. I mean, that must have been an exciting ride. What was that like?
It was, yeah. To be honest, I love my time at BCG. I should mention that 2 of those years were studying. So I did a 1-year MBA at INSEAD Business School, and then I did a 1-year MPA at Harvard. And I was fortunate enough to be sponsored through both of those at BCG. But to be honest, the reason why I left Goldman was because it was super, super narrow. So I was working in one delta macro trading, they called it, which is trading options and index futures and various other things. And I could tell you everything there is to know about trading European ETFs, but outside of that incredibly niche skill set, I felt like I didn't really have that, much outside of that, and I felt like the career path was very narrowing as well. There's very limited exit routes. Typically, you can go to a hedge fund or you can go to another bank, but kind of outside of that, it's not that broadening. Whereas consulting was the total opposite. It's every sector, all types of work, all types of clients. So I focused on kind of e-commerce, but I also did a huge amount in private equity. I did a bit in banking. I did a couple of projects in retail. It was just very, very varied and very interesting experience.
Yeah, I mean, just to dig in there a little deeper, what level of variability, what sort of projects are you being brought into and getting a handle? And so you're saying from e-commerce to retail, are you coming in and effectively analyzing, the current state business and effectively looking to, improve, increase the ROI? Are there specific functions that you're brought into? What was that level of exposure inside of a typical consulting engagement there?
Yeah, well, so I actually worked on a lot of kind of group strategy type projects, and typically the company would have 5 different ideas of things that they could do, should we launch into China, or shall we launch this new category product, or shall we streamline our operations somehow? and each of these require a lot of focus and resource, and therefore you can't do all of them. And so then it was just a question of trying to decide which one the company should do based on a whole bunch of analysis. And that's looking at best practice from other organizations. It's doing a whole bunch of number crunching and finding out which one is going to be the most profitable. It's looking at the internal capabilities and deciding which one is the most achievable, and then coming out with a recommendation essentially based on kind of interviews with very senior people and kind of insight from internal and external to the organization.
Awesome. To be honest, Adrian, that's exactly what I wanted to hear, because and that was the point I was sort of alluding to, is that when we think about the larger businesses and having an e-commerce seller who's doing $1 million isn't getting access to BCG consultants, right? Typically speaking, they're not going to go and engage BCG for likely the millions of dollars that's going to cost for them to actually be able to run a project. But that level of discovery, that level of planning, that level of strategy and resource invested in what is the right opportunity for us to go down, knowing that there's 5-10 different directions, or if we break it down into sort of the typical e-commerce seller, I've got 30 different products that I could launch. I could launch into X channel. I could decide to expand globally. I could do all these things. I feel that for sort of the earlier stage sellers, they often spend the time just sort of trying and through trial and error. But as you start to get larger, making these calculated risk assessments and deciding on the strategy of the business. Do I double down and diversify my product from having 3 SKUs to 15 SKUs, because I can build them on quick rotation? So I guess for those listening at home, like having you here, Adrian, and also having access to a consulting practice that we've built too, you get to a position where you're not making these knee-jerk reactions and, well, we need to drive revenue really quickly because we're trying to exit tomorrow. Let's quickly bring 5 more products in, and all of a sudden, we've got a really smart launch strategy and off we go. Everything's being done from a very decided and calculated high-level strategy that then filters down into, what's, I'm sure, we had a chat before and you showed me a presentation that you just gave. I mean, the information that you're sharing with potential sellers on why they would look to exit, on what are the options, on how they can get a larger multiple on their exit, whatever that looks like. I mean, you're giving them the tools and the insights so that they can make better decisions for themselves. So taking it back to Unibrands, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Yeah, Unibrands.
That is right. Yeah, Unibrands. Yeah.
Because there's also Unibrands, which which
I can't believe that because we were both in stealth mode, and then we both sort of merged from stealth mode at the similar time, and we're like, oh no.
So it's funny, and they spell it with a Y and you guys with an A, but I've actually heard them pronounce it sometimes Una as well, and I was like, holy, it's very confusing. I don't know. I actually don't think that there needs to be any consideration around a rebrand, because you guys have very different strategies, and I'm very curious to sort of get into that in a little later on. But I guess like the main reason why I'm laboring this point and why I prodded so deeply is that for sellers going through this journey, transitioning to a point where they're very much calculated on what is that end game, or if they're playing the infinite game, what am I actually building toward, and what are the levers that I can actually pull to help drive the business forward? I mean, in your experience, and maybe this is a good time to get into it, what are the things, or what are the levers that you guys are looking at to say, right, this is a business that makes sense for us, or these are some of the fundamentals or the elements that people who maybe a potential acquisition target for you guys, like, what does that actually look like? Why would you guys acquire a brand?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we have a whole bunch of criteria that we look at when we evaluate a brand, and we have cutoffs pretty much for each of the metrics that we look at. But then within each of the metrics, you can either be a high performer, a medium performer, a low performer, and added together, that will equate to a higher valuation for the business. So just to look at some of the metrics in particular, the first one, and kind of most obviously, is the profit margin. So for us, we we like businesses. You'd be kind of rated as a good business if you have a profit margin of greater than 20% as a net profit margin. Where we have a hard cutoff at kind of 10 or 12%, you really need to be above that on the trailing 12 months in order for us to look for an acquisition. But that's kind of where we look. Secondly is the complexity of the business, and we actually we really like simple businesses and one of the questions we ask sellers is, how many hours do you spend a week on your business? And the lower the better. When people tell us that they're up till midnight and this and that, that's what scares us, because that means that there's a whole bunch of knowledge about this organization that just purely resides in the seller's head, and trying to disentangle that is going to be very difficult. And one of the ways we measure that is by looking at the number of SKUs. So if a business has less than 50 SKUs, we typically say, that's a really great business from a simplicity perspective. We have a cutoff around 80 to 100. If it has more than 100 SKUs, it's going to probably be a very complex business and difficult to integrate. After that, you're talking about the kind of percentage spend on advertising revenue. Typically, we look for businesses with less than kind of 15% or so spend on advertising. In terms of business age, we look for businesses that are older than 6 months. We like businesses with high revenue growth, typically above 20% year on year. And then lastly, we look at the kind of category that the business is operating in. And it's important to pick a category at the beginning of your journey that is, it's difficult to predict the future, but there are some categories that have long-standing valued for investors, and others which are kind of long-term considered to be more volatile or unstable. So for us in particular, we focus on kind of the stable categories: home and living, pets, outdoors, baby, sports, those types of categories. Whereas we stay away from fashion or supplements or electronics, or certainly commoditized electronics anyway. As well as like fad items, face masks and fidget spinners and all of those types of things. So that's what we look for.
And I think to draw on that, and that's like a clear strategy, right? You guys have really identified, right, I want products that are going to be evergreen. I'm going to stick away from commoditized electronics because, even take the Apple, for example. Every single year, there's a new evolution, there's a new iPhone. And so as a result, these things become obsolete. And so you're going to have to continue to iterate. That means deeper investment into product development. For clothing, exactly. There's lots of challenges that exist around sizing. Is this in season this year? It might not be next year. All of a sudden, heavy dependence on product development when you look at the categories that you're going after, especially, let's talk about the back of what's happened with COVID. I think the number of pets that are now in homes has exponentially grown. I'm also a victim of that personally. We adopted a dog last year, and my fiance is pregnant as well. So I'm literally hitting every stereotype of the things.
Have you taken up cooking as well?
Yeah, cooking as well. Maybe less so, but all of these things, right? They're strategic decisions that a potential seller should be making. And you guys have built a very clearly defined. I know you're just scratching the surface, right? 5 years at BCG, I'm sure you have a very long list and a weighted point system as to what this multiple relates to and why this is a good decision and how we can expand it, whether it's through this channel or, we take on the same approach as well internally. We're constantly, life is about, thousands of decisions, micro decisions that we're making. But when you build that into the process that you guys have clearly defined, articulated, and I'm certain, especially after speaking with both Cedric and Tobias, you guys from an operational standpoint, are very well oiled, and it's something actually I want to dive into as well in a little bit. But when I'm hearing you, Adrian, go through this, nothing's happening by accident. From the decision to move into it to what we're going to acquire, and even the market that you guys are attacking, which I think you'd be the first in the world that I'm aware of in going after that APAC region, and also the approach with Lazada. I'd love to go a little bit deeper because this is not a topic that I've ever had the opportunity to speak to anyone about, because you guys are the first one out of APAC to come up, and you do have a slightly different strategy on that front. So I'd love if you could walk those listening, and we do get listeners in Australia and the region too. So I mean, pretty good opportunity to sort of highlight, at least at a high level, like what the strategy is and who these sellers, what platforms they're on, and I'll let you take it away, mate.
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, as I said, I started looking into this opportunity in the beginning of the year, and on the back of seeing the success in other regions, and I started looking into Amazon in Australia. And initially, I found that the market share of Amazon in Australia is much lower than in other regions. So I think they have about a 20% market share compared to eBay, for example, which has like a 60% market share. And initially, I was kind of put off by that because Amazon was the big play and all the rest of it. But actually, the more I looked into it, and I started speaking to people at Amazon Australia and eBay Australia and Catch and Kogan, and the more I looked into it, the more I realized there's actually a colossal opportunity in Australia. And that opportunity is twofold. One is that there are lots and lots of businesses who are based here that sell abroad. So we've acquired a number of Amazon businesses who are based in Australia, who are selling on Amazon.com, Amazon.co.uk, Amazon in Germany and France. And so that in itself is just a massive market that exists here. And that's really built up through a number of like very large Amazon seller networks in Australia, which don't really exist, for example, in Singapore or in other countries. For example, the Reliable Education Network or the Endgame Network, or there's a couple of different ones. So that's one thing, but then I guess the second opportunity is for kind of brands in Australia and in APAC that sell within the region. There are also a huge number of really great D2C and platform brands that we're seeing here. So one that we've just acquired, for example, is a company called Juju. It's the seller based in Perth. Built this great business. It's a period care product business, so it makes kind of period care cups and pants and various other things. Grown really, organically and very rapidly over the last few years. Seller was looking for, a way to take some chips off the table, and so we were kind of in the right place to take that brand under the Una Brands family, as it were. If I think about in the rest of the region, the big platforms in Singapore are Lazada and Shopee. Again, massive numbers of sellers in those markets with very limited liquidity options. But seeing exactly the same boom after COVID as all of the Amazon players in America have, and the rest of e-commerce. So it's a big market here. As you said, we're the first people to be, doing this kind of pan APAC play, and it actually works very well because there's a lot of synergies that you can get by doing this kind of pan APAC version of this business model.
Absolutely. I mean, right off the bat, there's not a whole lot of competition, right? When you look at what's happened to, for example, multiples in the Amazon, specifically FBA model space, it's gone up from, 3 years ago, you're probably lucky to get a 2.5 multiple, maybe a 3. Whereas now, that's moved up to a 4 and sometimes 5, and beyond, depending on obviously all the size of the business and the diversity of it. But right now, you've effectively created one of the only real exit opportunities for a lot of these sellers. So, you're effectively a market first for these sellers. So, if Thrasio has taught us anything, being first to market has some really significant advantages in what you're able to achieve. And that education process, you mentioned Endgame Network and the Education Network. I'm probably getting that wrong.
Reliable
education network. I mean, you guys can really stamp or solidify your position as the formal educators of like what's actually happening in the global market and how does this relate to, my business and how can I maximize this opportunity and partner with a brand that's really going to be able to take it to that next level. So, like I said, and I'll say it publicly, I have the utmost confidence in what you guys are doing. To get back to some of the questions I have, and I think questions that people may struggle with as well. Like I'm a huge advocator of having, a co-founder or co-founders. I think that, and again, this is just my personal opinion, but I think that to try and do things solo, I think even as a team or as a trio, it can be really taxing. There's a lot of ups and downs emotionally, and things never go 100% to plan. If they do, you're not pushing hard enough. The reality is having a co-founder or co-founders, I think, is a really strong play for anyone for that mental stability and to share in that experience as well. Really curious to hear how the three of you guys met and how, this came to be. So, what I'm deducing from the conversation we've had today is, you were working in the capital markets inside of BCG, really understanding what's happening in the e-commerce space, getting a handle into the magnitude of that opportunity. And what happened next? How did the three of you guys link up?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I should mention actually, there's actually 5 of us. So what you're saying about co-founders, I totally agree with. And having 5 of us, it has been very, very helpful. So in addition to the 2 guys that you've met, we also have Kushal, who's an ex-investment banker based in Singapore. He's head of kind of all of the acquisition side of things. And then we have Srini, who's a real tech guy who's based in India, and he heads up a now pretty large technology team in India. The way that we were actually put in touch was through our investors, and we all have like scarily similar stories, which is that we were all pretty much independently looking at this business model, and then making the first steps towards raising funding. Some of us further ahead than others. So funny, like strange coincidence about me is that I've actually got an identical twin brother who works for McKinsey in Dubai. And he was also looking at this business model, and so he's actually the founder of Apontia, which is an e-commerce aggregator based in Dubai. And so he was looking at throwing this business model around at the same time, and so basically I approached Apontia's investors and kind of pitched to them the Australia version of this business model, and they said, well, we really like the story and we think Australia is a great opportunity, but we're already looking at some people in Singapore. Why don't you guys speak and get in touch? So at that point I started speaking to Tobias and some of the others, and then from there we decided to merge together rather than compete, which has been a great decision. I think and Australia has been one of our biggest markets so far, but going forward, there's massive opportunity in APAC, in Asia, but also in China in particular is going to be a big opportunity for us.
Wow, that's really exciting. Geez, I'd hate to be, I'm just trying to think a couple of years down the track, I'd hate to be at the dinner table with the 2 of you guys, What, are you guys competitive in nature, you and your twin brother?
We are
you identical?
Competitive. Yeah, we're identical. Yeah, and we've had scarily similar lives actually. Now that I think about it, so we both studied maths for an undergrad. Then we both did a master's in math. Then we both went into trading. So my brother was a trader at BNP Paribas in London. Then we both did an MBA. So my brother was at Wharton. Then we both did an MPA. My brother was at Harvard at the same time as me. And then we both went into management consulting. My brother was at McKinsey. And then now we're both starting this pretty much very similar business on opposite sides of the world. So we haven't really planned for our lives to be quite so similar. But now that I kind of reflect, it is kind of weird how that's turned out. But it's kind of cool because we get to now talk about some of the journey that we're going through and have somebody else going through a kind of similar journey at the same time.
And I guess if you guys are attacking different markets, then you guys are even less directly competitors. And I also don't I mean, I don't really look at aggregators necessarily as direct competition, outside of the pure acquisition play of like, if we're trying to buy the same business, the reality is there's room for, unless it's the exact same category and the exact same strategy, that's when it probably would get a little hairy. But yeah, like I said, love to be a fly on the wall at dinner, in a couple of years' time from now.
Well, I mean, we're kind of competitive, but like I think we're more supportive of each other than we are competitive, in the sense that like if I'm having a difficult situation, I would definitely just get on the phone to him and be like, Phil, what do you think? Because I respect his opinion and all the rest of it.
That's
it's
awesome.
Useful.
So going back to the question though, definitely, yeah. I mean, that definitely, firstly, super interesting way to find your co-founders, and what a great way. Obviously, I sort of battle with the topic of the whole like 1% getting richer and the differential of like that gap. But the reality is, when you are as capable and as motivated, you're going to be attracted to the same like-minded people. It's not an intentional decision here. It's simply, I want to be pushed. I want to be with people who are doing exciting things, and together we can mutually add more benefit to one another and as a collective, and the flow on effect is huge. So I'm just a huge advocate of having other co-founders, and having 5, I'm sure, has different challenges to what having say 2 or 3 might look like. Again, I have no idea what it would look like when it comes to voting, or who owns what and how that all breaks down. And especially like, I don't know how much time you guys have had. Like, how long was it when each of you effectively were trying to attack the same problem from different areas? Like, what was that courting period?
So I'd say so Cedric, by the way, is not a co-founder, but we have our other co-founder is Kieran, who's based in Singapore. So Kieran was the first person to kind of get involved in this. So he's now the CEO. He started looking at this in July or around July last year. Kieran has a very impressive background. So he was at McKinsey for 5 years. He then founded 2 rocket internet ventures, both of which were kind of multi-million-dollar exits. One was Food Panda. I don't know if you're aware of it, but it's kind of similar to Deliveroo.
I am very. I mean, our whole team's out of the Philippines, so the number of Food Panda vouchers that we give out every week is enormous.
Yeah, I'm sure. So he founded Food Panda. He then left there or sold that business and became the CEO of Rocket Internet Asia for 2 years. And then he founded a second venture, which was called Zen Rooms, which he sold last year. And so basically he was looking for his next big venture to go into. And so started looking into the e-commerce kind of aggregator space. Kushal, who's our head of investments, I think started looking around November. I started looking around December time. I was actually the first person to come on board fully. So I came on board like full time in March. And then Kushal kind of joined, was working part-time, but then joined a month after that. And Tobias joined about the same time. But I've never met any of them in real life. So it's such a kind of COVID situation where you start a business with people you've never met before. So I'm very much looking forward when the border opens up to going to Singapore and meeting them all.
It's mad, that, isn't it? I mean, you guys have literally, I mean, I don't know what your Series A looked like, but you'd raised, 40 million in seed funding, working together, entirely remotely, having never met one another face to face. That really, I think it does 2 things. One, it's definitely a sign of COVID and how that's impacted the world, but it also shows us what's capable, having not needing to work one-to-one in the same office space, and what that division and how you can divide and conquer can really achieve. I mean, curious to know, like, what sort of regular meetings or cadences or reporting structures do you guys have? I was sort of saying to you before we hit record, I started the podcast because we were growing so rapidly and I couldn't learn fast enough. I couldn't learn how do we build senior management, middle management, and the effective reporting cadences, and how do we continue to grow multiple businesses, in similar but different directions. And, there's a lot of just questions that come up in my mind. You guys, obviously are venture backed and have, put together a very succinct directive, and, you're driving obviously in a uniform direction, and you've built your hypothesis. I mean, what is the regular cadence of meetings look like? How are you guys building strategy? Like, what is that from an operational perspective? What does that look like for you guys?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the great things about the founding team is that we all have quite different skill sets. So Srini is the tech guy. So he's based in India. He kind of focuses all his time on that. Kushal is the investments guy. Tobias is the operations guy. Kieran does most of the fundraising and investor relations, and then I do the kind of group strategy and kind of Australia, all of the Australia acquisitions. So the teams that we've built are operate, relatively well in their kind of in their zones. We try and have as much cross collaboration as possible, but the operations team does all the operations, so they it's great for them to all be working together. In terms of like the meetings that we have together, so we have one founders meeting once a week, which is like an hour's call or whatever. But then we will see each other. We have an investment committee actually pretty much every single day, and so all of us are on the investment committee, and so we'll check in there with each other. So in the investment committee, we're deciding on whether to make an acquisition into a particular business or not, or sometimes we'll have 2 or 3 businesses come up, and then so those are the kind of formal checkpoints. We have a town hall, every month or 2 months with the whole organization, and then I have a fortnightly town hall just for the Australia team as well. Those are the kind of formal checkpoints, and then all of the different projects that we're running have other touch points as well. That's how I run.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And, similar to how we run, I mean, we don't have investors, but, we do that. We do our quarterly town hall. We have a monthly internal team meeting, and we do a lot of things that are, you've got to communicate different things to different people, especially as the business grows. Like, there's no need for the entire company to know, for example, about, do we need to invest, the head of technology, or let's say, the developers don't necessarily need to be involved in, is this a good acquisition or not? But in terms of the direction of the business and what there is to be excited about and what's actually transpired, I mean, that becomes highly valuable. You're trying to build that culture, and you guys have clearly gone down the path of having sort of single-threaded leadership across specific functions. And, that's also the beauty of having so many founders who are, world-class and experts in their field. I mean, if you haven't heard of Food Panda, it's absolutely enormous to have the person who built and sold Food Panda as the CEO of the business. I mean, for someone like me, I have a deep appreciation, and also knowing that I believe it was Cedric who spent 5 years with Lazada.
Tobias, yeah.
Tobias.
Cedric was at McKinsey. Yeah.
Sorry, that's right. My mistake. One impressive credential to the next. It was. It's funny, and you guys are all super humble. When I was speaking to you, and you were sort of rattling off, your experience, it was done, like just sort of very blasé or very like, okay, cool. And then when I spoke to both, Tobias and Cedric, I was like, whoa. I'm not even worthy to give my background on the back of what you guys have all managed to achieve here. So just super impressive team, but it also means that you're able to accomplish so much more having and building the teams. We were talking a little bit about how we might work together, having those senior leaders in place and having them build out their respective teams, and all of the we run on EOS. Traction EOS, the entrepreneurial operating system, just as a baseline. I think it has some really good structures, but having those leaders then build out their teams really empowers them and allows you to create a whole lot more bandwidth. And it's only once you have heads, always hiring heads of divisions, hiring senior management, and having them build out, you're going to cover a whole lot more ground. But it's all rooted in who owns what, from a fundamental, and then how do we actually communicate that messaging for any growing business. I mean, it's a very different reality. Taking it back to sort of the Amazon seller that's hitting $1 million, $2 million in revenue, or, you know, the Lazada seller, or, you know, Amazon Australia, or wherever it is. The evolution of your business journey shifts quite rapidly as you grow. You can't touch every single thing that you were once able to touch. And so to take on a venture like what Una Brands is effectively as a group trying to achieve, it's an impossibility to have one key player, you know, central to it, being able to achieve all of that. I mean, it's just, you know, it's huge. The amount of moving pieces, from how do we find the potential acquisition or the potential businesses that we're looking to buy in each of the different regions, to how do we then build the operational infrastructure to, you know, expand that out, or run just the business as usual, to, you know, what does the future state look like in the category, and the strategic decisions around, you know, how to, because it's going to change in time, obviously. You know, this game is changing so quickly. Even looking back, you know, a year ago, $500,000 in EBITDA was a really attractive business. Get to $500,000, great. Now, when you look at, and I'm talking specifically for typically like the Amazon FBA model, which is a little bit more evolved. You know, we're looking at probably 3 or 4 years that Thras has been in market now. You know, everyone else that's coming into the space, $1 million of EBITDA is going to be the baseline, because it's too small below that for what they would look to achieve. So, you know, you guys are coming in at a really interesting time, and with a different strategy, and something that, you know, you have, you know, built in more breathing room, because it's going to take time for people to be able to dominate these markets. And, you know, it is a real USP from an acquisition standpoint, from a growth standpoint. So yeah, I mean, I just keep in my head, I'm running through like, okay, this really does sound like a super exciting opportunity in terms of what you're doing. And also for potential brands that want to grow with you guys. So I know that we're coming to the end of our conversation here, but before, you know, I let you go, I'd love, I mean, you did talk a little bit about, you know, what are the models, or what are the potential businesses, and sort of the baselines of what would be an attractive acquisition. But I mean, anything else on that? Who do they get in touch with if they were to sell? Like, what's your process? Any other information? I'd love to just give you the floor and walk through it.
Yeah, for sure. And one question that comes up from sellers a lot is like, what can I do to prepare my business for sale? You know, I'd like to sell in like a year's time. What can I do to maximize the value that I derive when I exit? And there's a few things that people can do, I guess. One is to make sure you have like clean financials and clean everything inside the organization. And it sounds simple, but the number of businesses that we go to value where, you know, we'll be looking through accounts, and they'll have mixed 2 businesses together, and then there's some personal expenses, and we're trying to piece out, okay, was this expense for here or here? It just becomes a nightmare, and becomes very difficult to have confidence around those numbers, which you know, people like us are looking for kind of confidence. Secondly, I would say, you know, where it makes sense, outsource everything, because as I said earlier, one of the questions we ask is, how much time do you spend on your business? And if you can say, look, I run this business on 1 day a week, that's music to our ears. And it's possible. Like you really can run some of these businesses on 1 day a week with the right supports in place. And then I guess one misconception that people sometimes have is they think, okay, I want to sell my business, so I'm going to expand into like 5 different countries and launch all these products and all the rest of it. And they very dramatically increase the complexity of their businesses without necessarily generating the revenue from those that you know, it would be required to justify them. So, you know, I would say focus on your core markets and your core products and do those really well. And if you want to expand to 1 or 2 other things, do that, you know, in a very targeted way, but don't scatter yourself very, very, very thinly. And then lastly, just make sure all of the admin is there, from like intellectual property and trademark hygiene and you know, compliance with all of the Amazon regulations and all the rest of it. It's very important when we're looking at businesses that all of that stuff's in place, basically. And so in terms of what are the steps if somebody were to want to sell their business? The first step would be getting a valuation done, which we typically take about a week to do a valuation of a business. We would look at the P&L. We would look at we'd get view only access to if they were selling on Amazon or Shopify or whatever. And from that, we'd construct our evaluation of the business. If you liked our offer, you would sign a letter of intent, and we would then move into a detailed due diligence phase, which would take about 3 weeks. And then after the end of 3 weeks, we would transfer the money and transact the accounts. It's an extremely streamlined and straightforward process. We try really hard to make it as pleasant an experience for sellers as possible. So yeah, that would be what people should do.
Perfect. And we have a solid presence in the Philippines and through Southeast Asia. So hopefully some of the listeners will be reaching out. What's the best way for them to actually start this process if they wanted to contact you?
Yeah, they can reach out to me directly. My email is adrian@una-brands.com, which is una-brands.com. Or you can go onto the website, and we've got a form you can fill in, or the website's una-brands.com. So yeah.
And we'll drop that in the show notes as well. We'll drop the website and that form and how they can get in touch as well. But Adrian, it's been an absolute pleasure sitting down and having a chat with you.
The pleasure is all mine.
Really.
Thank you.
Super interesting to get a look in at what you guys are up to, and yeah, just really excited to follow the journey along. So thanks so much for taking the time. I know how busy you are and the team is, but yeah, really appreciate it.
No, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me. It's been great.
Awesome. Thanks, mate.